Welcome back to Textile Talks. I'm Amy Milne, Executive Director of the Quilt Alliance, and I want to thank you for making time to join us today. Textile Talks is a weekly series presented in partnership by the Quilt Alliance and our 5 sister organizations shown here. Almost 1 year ago, hard to believe, when we were all suddenly experiencing the isolation of the pandemic, we combined creative forces to bring our members weekly content intended to inspire and educate. And a lot has happened in the last 12 months to us all and to our organizations. And we have been thrilled to see how many of you have tuned in and kept tuning in to our weekly presentations from all over the world. So I want to thank you. The Quilt Alliance is probably, I think, is the smallest member of our powerhouse consortium, but our mission is huge: to document, preserve, and share the stories of all quilts and all quilt makers. Our vision is no more anonymous quilt makers. Visit our website, which is www.quiltalliance.org, to sample our projects and join us. For as little as $30, you can become a member, and I hope you will all do so. We need your support now more than ever, and you get a lot of bang for your buck. So go to the website and check it out. You can sample our projects that are listed here. And if you have any questions, that contact email, information@quiltalliance.org, is an easy way to reach us. My colleague Emma Parker will be manning the chat box today. So if you have any questions there, she'll catch them. And she'll try to echo the web links that we share and the information that we share in the slides in the chat box as well. I want to thank our all of our sponsors, because we are able to offer this series free to you because of their generosity. They are underwriting the series. You can see here, all of them are, well, most of them are probably companies you're familiar with, but there may be some that you aren't familiar with. I ask you to visit them, visit their websites, patronize them, and remember them. These companies see us nonprofit partners as important partners, and they value you as customers. So we're thrilled to start this second year. I can't believe I'm saying that. It seems like yesterday we just started this, but second year of Textile Talks soon, thanks to these partners and thanks to you. So today's topic is quilt history projects that hit home. And I'll be serving as the moderator. And then I've got 2 guests, Donna Richardson, who is the founder of the Washington State AfricanAmerican Quilt Documentation Project, and Lynn Lancaster Gorges, who is a textile conservator. She's a restoration specialist and the owner of Historic Textiles Studio here in North Carolina. I found out about Donna's project through an Alliance board member who had seen an article, a newspaper article about her project. And she said, wow, this is really impressive. This person has taken on this personal documentation project. And it really, we had a conversation. I emailed her and we had a phone conversation, and I thought, you know, I think that there are probably this would really resonate with other folks here in the US and around the world who had the idea to do a personal documentation project. It could be a family project. It could be have to do with their own family heritage or cultural connections. It could have to do with a place, a type of pattern. So I invited Donna and Lynn to be in conversation to present their work today and their research, but also to be in conversation with me and invite you into that conversation towards the end about what it means to take on a project like this. And hopefully by the end of the day, you might be thinking, wow, maybe it's time for me to get busy with my, my own quilt documentation project. And then I'm going to have them sort of introduce themselves. So they're each going to take about 10 minutes to present their work. And then we'll have some questions. And then if you have questions, if you would put those questions in the Q&A box versus the chat box. The chat box is great for conversation. I love seeing all the conversation going on already. Please keep that up. But in order for us to make sure we don't miss your question, please put that in the Q&A and then we'll get to it at the end. I'm going to turn it over now to Donna, and I will turn my video off and let her go. But thank you so much for joining us, Donna. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing about your project again.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for this opportunity to talk about the Washington State African-American Quilt Documentation Project. My name is Donna Richardson, and I live in Washington State. I was born and raised here, and in my past life, I spent almost 25 years in the Air Force as a budget analyst. After I retired, I continued working another 14 years. And when I got ready to retire for a second time, I knew I couldn't just stay at home after working all those years. So I went looking for something to do. And that's when I found, excuse me, next slide. I'm sorry, okay. And that's when I found quilting. But once I got into quilting, I came across why quilts matter. And it had such a profound impact on me that I must have watched it a dozen times. And I just became totally ate up with quilt history. It made me see how quilts and life and the world were all tied together. I started collecting quilts. I went out searching for antique quilt patterns. I began building my own quilt history library. I even saw that the University of Nebraska had a graduate certificate program in quilt studies. I enrolled, I took 4 or 5 classes, but I didn't finish. I got booted out when they realized that my finance degree didn't carry enough history credits. So I kind of moved on from there, and I became interested in state documentation projects. And the one for Washington State, Women in Their Quilts, was done in 1989, but it did not cover the entire state, and it was void of diversity. And I'd like to think that it was the times and not a deliberate slight. Next slide, please. So this is where Washington State African-American Quilt Documentation Project comes in. I took this on as a personal mission to find and document the African-American quilts here in Washington. I wanted to tell their stories. I wanted the data included in the state archives along with women and their quilts. And if I'm able to do this, I would need to have something to show for it. So my vision also included doing exhibits and having a publication. But what's missing from this chart I forgot to put in is I also wanted to be ready to work with the Washington AQSG when or if there was another statewide documentation project, I would be ready and the African-American quilts could be included. Next slide, please. So I just jumped right in. I mean, I didn't know any other way to do this. I just started informing the African-American community about what a documentation project was and why we do them. I began signing up as a vendor at all the major Black history events. I got a table, hung quilts, laid out flyers and books, and just started talking and networking. At the top picture there, I'm at a conference center at a Black history event. I made sure I was there early, grabbed the first table closest to the door, and just went for it. And then I started scheduling documentation days at the libraries and churches. I used several sources to develop my own 6-page intake form. And I purchased just about everything you could think of that you would need to do a documentation project. And I felt that if I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. And if I don't succeed, it won't be because I wasn't prepared. Next slide, please. So by doing this solo, I can't stress enough publicity, promotion, and networking. That's probably the main thing that got this up and running. I just got out there. I had a website that I used for scheduling. People could go out there and see where the dates, times, and places were and just fill in their names and how many quilts they had. I did press releases and sent to the local newspapers. I did a television segment, letters to the local guilds, and I took flyers to the quilt shops. And then this list of groups within the African American community, I went out and spoke to these groups. And this list here is not quite all inclusive, but anyone that would like to go looking for African American quilts in an African American community, this would be a good place to start, because these groups here you will find in just about every African American community across America. These pictures here, I was looking at my timer and it went off, but that's okay. These pictures here are, there's a news article at the top there that was done on the project. To the far right there is a flyer from one library that I went and spoke at about Gee's Bend. And on the bottom there is another flyer where I went and spoke at a government facility about this project during Black History Month. Next slide, please. And again, this is more promotion. I had flyers and postcards. The postcards were kind of easy. I could put the pictures on there, and on the back, I would fill it out with all the information that I would want the community to know about what a documentation day is and how we go about doing it. But it's very, very important to promote your project, especially when you're dealing with a community that is uninformed and knows little to nothing about you. You have to put yourself out there. I did a press release that led to a picture and an article in the paper that led to the TV segment, and just on and on and on. Next slide, please. So going forward, I would like to continue to search and collect and catalog the data on the quilts. And with COVID, I need to rethink or redo my plan to cover the rest of the state. I also need to update and redo my intake form to better line up with the changes that the Quilt Index has made. And funding. I will still be self-funded going forward, but not like before. I will go after speaking engagements and grants more aggressively. When I started this up, I mean, I would go and speak if someone asked me to, but I wasn't aggressively going after those engagements. This time I will. And the same with grants. I think I applied for one grant and I didn't get it. So I said, oh, well, and just moved on. But this time I will go forward and ask for grants, because if I'm going to go across the state, that's going to involve travel and other things and the like. And then continue to develop institutional relationships. And what I mean by that is I had an art exhibit running for about 3 months at the art museum. And once I got this project going, they've agreed to support me on that because I, did something with them before. The same with the historical societies. I'd like to get in touch with the Black Historical Society and have an exhibit in the African American History Museum in Seattle. And then the universities. I'm going to continue to work with the University of Washington for their migration demographics to analyze the quilt data. So that's kind of where I'm at today, kind of in a lull, waiting for the virus to pass, but also preparing so that I can jump back in and get started. And these two pictures here, just to say a little bit about them, I put them up there to kind of give you an example of some of the quilts that, or the range of the quilts that I'm getting. I mean, these two here is anything from well kept, which would be the bottom one, to the top one, which is basically, I had to put it back together to lay it flat. It was basically in tatters and stuffed with newspapers. So I get a large range of quilts that I've seen so far. But that's it for me as far as the African American Quilt Documentation Project. And thank you so very much, Amy, for this opportunity.
Thank you. This is such, it's not only an impressive project in what you've done in the time that you've started, since you've started it, but it's also impressive to me how you said you mentioned your background in finance and in the military, and how that wasn't, didn't dovetail seemingly with quilt studies, but it's very obvious to me how you use that, your analytical skills and your organizational skills to plan and implement this project. And I think that's one of the most useful things that you can pass on to others who are thinking about quilt documentation projects. So I'm still in awe of what you've done. And, I thank you so much for the way that you laid it out in such practical terms too. So we'll do some more of that in our discussion, but thanks, Adana.
Thank you.
So I'll invite Lynn to come on now. And, I'll say Lynn, I think I met Lynn at we had a Quilters Take Raleigh event before we did Quilters Take Manhattan, and you attended that. And I'm in North Carolina, you're in New Bern, and I'm in Cary, North Carolina. And we, of course, crossed paths with other quilt history. And I just was so impressed with your NC Plaids project. So I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and your projects. And let me get the move the slides on, and then I will mute and stop my video. But thanks, Lynn.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about plaids, and it's always nice to talk about North Carolina. So this is a special event. I would also like to make sure everyone knows that Suzanne McDowell, who lives in Cullowhee, is also my partner in this research, and she did a lot on this PowerPoint that we have here. In fact, she presented this particular one at AQSG in Indianapolis. So we continue to offer this to people, and we are both available for speaking to quilt guilds, to historical societies, because we think that it's very, very important that in a state like North Carolina that has such a strong textile tradition, that we keep it alive and talk with people and find out as much as we can. So next slide, please. So you think that's an Alamance Plaid in your quilt. We hear that a lot. We heard that at the AQSG meetings. Just a lot of quilt guilds, is this an Alamance Plaid? And what is that? That would be a North Carolina produced plaid. So next slide. I didn't have a clue what in the world this was. And I was in New York for a session with Rabbit Goody, and I took a raggedy old quilt of my family's. It's one of these hanging behind me. And I got there and I thought, oh my gosh, nobody's going to really care about this quilt, but she wanted us to take something that looked homespun. And I took this quilt and she said, oh my goodness, those are Alamance Plaids. And I said, and what are they? She said, "You've not read The Paper and Uncoverings by Irma Kirkpatrick?" And I was totally oblivious to it. So in 1988, Irma Kirkpatrick, who also wrote about the Uncle Eli's quilt party, which will be tomorrow. It's always the first Thursday of April. And so I immediately said, "What is this?" And she said, "Well, they were the first dyed fabrics produced in North Carolina. It's not a print, but they would dye the yarn separately and then create plaids. And this was done around 1857 by E.M. Holt. And that just took off. And these were a plaid that they called homespun plaids. And so up until then, they were just doing a plain cloth. Next one. So I found out that not only did my family have this one quilt, which you see up here, it looks kind of like a ratty quilt, but there are actually 57 different plaids and jeans fabrics in it. I got home and found out that we had about 10 quilts like this in my family. Next slide. They were probably made by Betty Pilkington and her daughters, and her daughter was my grandmother, and also her sister, Eva Pilkington Pate. And Eva Pate's husband had a small general store. Next question, next slide, please. So I started doing more and more research. And where did these come from? Why did my family have so many quilts like this? And I ended up finding out that one of the big reasons was because they were produced in North Carolina, but they also became very, very cheap and were easy to use. Next slide. So next slide, please. They were making these plaids, and I personally think, I've not found documentation to back this up, but I think that the plaids were being made, number one, because they were able to buy the equipment from New England, because by then New England was going into the business of printed textiles. But also, I think the influence of the Scots-Irish who were living in the Piedmont area of North Carolina. And the Piedmont area includes Alamance County, which is where Burlington is. And we've all heard about Burlington, and these mills ended up evolving into the big Burlington mills. So this is a wonderful label that was used in advertising, Hults Glencoe plaids. So they were making plaids they called first generation plaids prior to the Civil War, but they also continued making plaids during the Civil War. And then later, after the Civil War, it really took off, and Holt had lots of children. And so they all got to get into the business and had lots of mills. Next slide, please. And so we see that so then I started doing a survey. Where do you find these quilts? And I was finding them all over the place. You see, we have a star, we have waves, we have all types. Next slide, please. And there seemed to be that I was finding, as I was seeing more and more of these quilts, not just my family quilts, that there were just tremendous array of patterns, and that they were patterns primarily seen from about 1875 to about 1910, 1920. Next slide, please. So they ended up transporting these plaids all over the state with the growth of the railroad and the plank roads. So you see that they were going all over. And then after the 1870s, they were growing, plants were in other areas. And they were not just North Carolina. There were plaids being produced in Virginia and in South Carolina and in Georgia just not as many. And they were sold with very different names. So it's interesting to read about the newspaper with the newspaper advertising to see the different names they give them. Next slide, please. So as you see, prior to 1860, you had 6 meals. And then in later on, it was 7, 9, and then next slide, please. So see how it's just growing. And so after the Civil War, I mean, it just took off because that was another industrial revolution. And the power of water and the power of entrepreneurship took off in a tremendous way. Francis Fries in Salem, North Carolina, was also making plaids. So it wasn't just the Hults. Many other families were now getting into the action. The Battle family of Rocky Mount was also doing some plaids. Next slide, please. And this is in Greensboro. Next slide. And then this is the Hults, 7 sons and 3 daughters born from 1829 to 1851. So that is where they really took off. They had a lot of money and they had a lot of land. And so they started getting in heavily into the textile production. Next slide, please. So this is talking about the 1853 when they decided to start dyeing blues and dyeing browns and to start making plaids. So those are the plaids that we see the most often. So they had to hire a dyer who knew exactly how to do it. Of course, people were dyeing then, but someone who knew how to do it in a large, large way to be able to manufacture. Next slide, please. So, see, my father trained all of his sons in the manufacturing business. So, this is how you see so many of these, and they were 27 inches wide. So, go to the next slide, please. We're going to zip through these. So, if we were doing a major presentation, I'd be telling you all sorts of stories. But with this, I'm just kind of getting you a background information on how we did the documentation. So, here are more ads. Next slide, please. Next slide, more ads. And we are still trying to figure out what were the very first plaids. We've got some sample books to look at and some samples. These are samples of plaids from my collection, which I now own over 50 plaid quilts and probably 25 plaid items, but probably only 25 of those are now determined to be North Carolina produced prior to 1900. Next slide, please. And these show the plaids. And as you'll see to the right of your screen, you've got it shows the homespun texture of it. So a lot of people thought of these as, oh yes, you know, my great grandmother wove this at home. Probably not. So they were cranking them out. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about the documentation real quick. With the documentation, as I said, I had all of these quilts that I had bought. I also had 10 from my family. And we had all of these items, and people kept saying, what is an Alamance plaid? What is a North Carolina homespun plaid? And so I gathered some friends of mine, and I'm not even going to list all the names because if I forgot anyone, I'd feel terrible. Because Suzanne and I just had a blast working with all these terrific women who came for 2 days. And what we did a little bit different from a traditional documentation project because I have been involved in those with counties or cities. But with this, we really wanted to determine weave structure. And, you know, was it a how many passes per inch was it? And we found that these primarily were 32 by 32 or up to 40 by 40. So they were fairly open weave, and we wanted to look at the patterns and compare them to other plaids. So this was done in a little bit different way. So it really was very helpful to have all of these people. We took photographs. We used, go to the next slide, please. Next slide, and I'll show the microscope. There we go. So we were taking the pick count, and that's in the lower thing portion of that. And then up at the top, that's Suzanne. And Suzanne was the one who was working the microscope. So next slide, please. And we were talking about the color family, you know, warm browns, blue plaids combination. And there were a lot of ginghams and a lot of jeans also. This is a picture of a cotton bowl quilt. That's the pattern name, but it certainly was not using one of the more open weave homespun. This was a very fine quilt. Next one, please. So here you see the difference. You've got the weave structure, the plain on one side, you've got the twill on the other. Primarily, we are seeing the weave structure of the plain plaids in the quilts, but we are seeing some of the jeans. The plain weave was used more for women's clothing, women's bonnets, aprons, dresses, quilts, and then the jeans was used some in quilts, probably just the leftovers, but that was men's pants and men's coats. And we are still looking for these items. So if you look at these today and you go, oh yeah, my grandmother's got these, right, on these, then please let us know. So scoot along, please. And I'll wrap it up. Okay, so keep going. So this shows how we looked at the microscope version of it. Keep going, going. And so as you see, this was a very labor-intensive project. What we are planning on doing with this, we would like to eventually have a website that we could help people identify their plaids. And you could see early plaids. We're focusing on 1860 to about 1900. And so if you know of anyone who is interested in doing that kind of research and has grants, let us know. We'd appreciate it. So thank you very much. And I'm delighted that I was able to share with you plaids that were made in North Carolina and possibly a few other southern states, but primarily North Carolina. And they found their way all the way across the country. So we hope to keep hearing more and more about them. So thank you very much, Amy, for inviting me. This has been a wonderful experience.
Thank you, Lynn. That is so interesting. And I'm now, since we've met and I found out about your project, I'm definitely much more aware of looking for plaid quilts. And I hope all of you will continue keeping your eye out, especially if you live in North Carolina. But as you know, as we know, quilts travel with people. And they're everywhere. So thank you so much. I think some folks maybe are hearing some music in the background in your room. If you have,
There's no music. I'm on a highway. I bet it's some cars.
Maybe that's it. So, and we were hearing.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. You never know on Zoom. It's hard to suss out where the sounds are coming from, but your audio was great for me. And that was really fantastic. And I'd like to invite Donna to come back on now so we can have a little conversation. I'm going to keep the slides up for a minute because I know she's prepared a couple slides that kind of address some of my questions. And we've got a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So I don't want to take up too much time with my questions, but we talked about one of the things that I wanted to ask both of you, and I'm going to go ahead and put Donna's slide up and ask her this question first. what did you learn? You know, if you can summarize what you learned in the, how many years has the project been going on now?
Well, off and on. I initially started in 2015, and I must have ran documentation days for about 3 or 4 months that year. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
taking my own time and doing it.
So,
And then since then, it's just been like a onesie, twosie, maybe talk to a few people, set something up, but nothing big. And then once I got ready to pick it back up, we got into a pandemic. So
right. So we
so
talked a little bit on our rehearsal call about the challenges and also just lessons learned. So would you address that, what you feel like you've learned so far with the project?
sure. As I said before, I mean, and throughout my presentation, it's so important to stay in the public eye when you're unknown. I'm African American. I can walk into an African American community, and we've talked about this on the phone.
Yeah.
How can someone go in there? You have to get yourself out there so the people can see you. You know, so that's very important. Staying in the public eyes. Once they know who you are and they know what you're doing, they'll feel comfortable. But that it has to be an ongoing thing. Because these quilts aren't readily available. So it has to be an ongoing thing. That's what I learned. Just don't put one flyer out and go. You have to keep going. Assistance, the right person for the right task. Normally on documentation days, you would have a trained group or crew to help you out. Going solo, you may end up with Miss Lorraine, who's 89 years old, 4.5 feet tall, and she wants to hang quilts. So, you know, you have to, you know, put people in the right place so you can do what you're doing. And then a website. I use the website for just about everything. It adds visibility to you and legitimacy. People will go out there and look, and you can put more information out there. Dates, places, and times, even the status of how your project is going. It keeps everything all in one place. I didn't do that the first time, so that was a lesson for me. And not to saturate the documentation days. Don't overbook or overlap. It was very important to me to get as accurate a data as possible. I knew at some point I would need to go back, but I didn't want that to be a back and forth, you know. So I tried to get as much as I could the first time. And I did not like to rush the storyteller. I got the best stories just letting it flow. And above all, excuse me, save your back, knees, and energy. The best purchase I made for this project was a rolling cart. I just can't tell you enough. If you don't buy anything else, get a cart. Um, and then I wanted to say a little bit about the picture here, if I could. This is my neighbor, and this is his family quilt. And I put it up here to remind myself to just mention that I was somewhat surprised at how many men brought in quilts when I started doing the documentation days. So,
That
for me, those were the lessons I've learned so far.
I think that's fascinating. Have
Mhm.
you, are any of those sounding familiar to you, Lynn, in terms of lessons learned in the many, many documentation days you've done?
Well, I think that it is very important not to try to do too much in that day, because as Donna said, you have people telling their stories, and you don't want to rush them, because if you do, a lot of times that's when you really miss some important facts. And you want them to be there long enough that they're feeling comfortable with you, and they want to share. So no, I think she had some really good points there.
And I think with our documentation days that we've done, I think trust is, you have to really earn the trust of your colleagues that you're working with. I mean, the folks that are sharing their quilts with you. And part of that is being very organized, I think, and sharing information in advance, and doing what you say you're going to do. That's what we've learned is clear communication and, following up and doing what you say you're going to do. Um, I know you've got, um, also just in terms of challenges, you put together some feedback on that. Um, you mentioned
Uh,
gaining trust here too.
yes, the challenge, these are African American quilt owners, and and I'm sure it's just not the African American community, but these quilts are not connected to the quilt world. So
Right.
the conventional methods that we would use, like a quilt call or notifying the guilds or other quilt organizations about a quilt documentation day, um, the African American community would never hear it. And so I needed to stress in this presentation, you're going to have to go further and work harder to get the word out. It won't work any other way, not just with African American quilts, but anything that's not connected to the quilt world if you're going to go out there looking for it. And then gaining trust. I had a whole spiel on this, and then I call this the Johnson quilt. And this really, this is not the best picture, but this quilt really belongs in a museum. It has silk commemoration ribbons sewn in with printed dates back to the 1880s. And if you could tap on that middle
Yeah.
picture, and a little spiel about the quilt owner.
When I play this, everyone, I think you should turn your volume up. The volume is a little bit low, so it's audible and it's fine. You just might want to go ahead and turn your volume up as I hit play. I'm going to do that. I think my volume impacts that too. So let me do that.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
What took you so long to actually come and actually do? I know you said your wife.
Well, it's a thing.
Prompted you.
It's just a part of. I'm an only, okay, and so I don't really have any direct brothers. I have half brothers and sisters, but I don't have any other relatives to, to give this to. And it's just one of those things where I just kept it. My dad gave it to me. It's something
yours.
from. It's my dad. He gave it to me. It's part of him, and my legacy from his side of the family. And that's why I just kind of kept it under wraps. It's taken my wife this long to get me to, we saw the article in the paper and she said we should go do this.
Oh, thank you.
So
Thank you. It's a good thing. And now that you've allowed us to do this, we can get it published. And so I just wanted to show that as an example of gaining trust. I mean, these quilts are in closets, up under beds, in garages, used for throws over God knows what. And so I just go out and tell them to bring them in any kind of way they can, but it's almost like pulling teeth. This gentleman was his quilt was held very close to him. He hadn't taken it out of the closet since since it was given to him, and that was many years ago. So it's a challenge, but when you find a gem, it's wonderful too. And then going on to funding as a challenge. Funding is always going to be difficult, especially when you're solo, but it's not impossible. And when I say build a repertoire, I mean, I did this bare bones from scratch. I mean, you just buy things as you need them. But I figured, why dip into my own purse? I can use my own voice. I mean, I went out and I gave presentations on quilt history and G's Bend. And, I have story quilts on African American children's stories, and I go to schools. And so, I mean, sell yourself. I mean, you can make candles, whatever. I mean, funding doesn't have to be a challenge, but it's if you don't have backing, it's something you're going to have to stay on.
Right. Building sustainability into your project is critical.
Mhm.
I was wondering, Lynn, along those same lines that Adana brought up about gaining trust and moments where people are hesitant to share, have you ever had either in a documentation day or amongst your own family, because I know a lot of your collection is from family, a moment where the person that you wanted to share the quilt or you wanted to document a quilt, they were not forthcoming for whatever reason?
Well, one of the things is these quilts are primarily utilitarian quilts. They're
Mm,
not showstoppers like this
right.
one that Adana is showing. And so a lot of times the people think, oh, it's not a very good quilt. It was just one that we all, well, in fact, some of ours, we would use them on the sand at the beach, to lay on the beach. So yeah, we did a lot of that because, it was just, those are the old quilts, and they were not, just gorgeous quilts, but they're very special quilts. And then I also, but then I have one funny story that I had a relative who had one in a horse barn, and I found it, and I mean, it was pretty disgusting, but I still wanted it in its disgusting state just to show a few of the plaids that were in there. Well, then the person decided, oh, this quilt must be really valuable. And it was kind of like, no, it's not. It's not worth anything to anybody but to people like me, that we use it as research. So I'm not trying to exploit you for your valuable item. And I think some people, maybe Donna, they might see that too. Oh no, are they going to? Do they want to buy my quilt?
Yes.
Or do they want to buy it real or something? And it's like they have a hard time understanding that no, we're doing this for research,
Mhm.
and we are doing it share knowledge with other people. So we're not doing this as a thing that we're trying to make money and do all this.
Right.
And as far as the money, we did use an AQSG grant that was great. And it was very helpful to me and Suzanne. It wasn't a tremendous grant, but it did pay for us to go to Burlington. It paid for our gas because we live 12 hours from each other, and Burlington's kind of right in the middle. So she's at one end of North Carolina, I'm at the other. She's in the mountains, I'm on the coast. And so it gave us the opportunity to at least be able to pay gas and get a hotel room for 2 or 3 nights so we could go to different um, museums in the Burlington area. And that was
And
Oh,
AQSG is American Quilt Study Group, just to Julie
yes,
reminded
sorry.
us to say that whole name.
Yes.
I think that we've got so much to talk. We need another hour. Can everybody? I know everybody can't stay for another hour, but we've got so many questions, and I'm going to jump in and try to ask a couple of these. I'm just reading them as I go through and call them, but I know that there were a bunch of questions specifically, Lynn, about plaids. Were the plaids made from cotton, linen, or wool?
Cotton, all
Cotton.
cotton.
Um, were these the same plaids that were used as mattress coverings? Someone wants to know.
No, no, not like, they're not pillow ticking. I mean,
Right.
because that's what I think of for mattress or pillow coverings. So
And someone's wondering, did all the homespun originate in North Carolina?
no, no, there was lots of homespun, especially in England in the 1700s, probably earlier. So there's sample books that show that. It was just that, and there was a lot of homespun being done in New England, starting around 1830, 40 time period. But then they went to printing, and so they started selling their machinery to the South.
And we will be able to save the chat and the Q&A, so both of you will be able to see these questions later, even if we don't get to them. And I just want to take a moment to encourage those of you who don't get your question answered to reach out to Adana and Lynn for the answers to your questions. We've given both of their web address and their email address, and I'm sure they would love to hear from you. Of course, if you would like to have one of them make a presentation, especially, I would love to have you email them, or, if you have a quilt that is falls in their wheelhouse, I'm sure they would love to hear from you. Scott has a question for Adana, and he's asking, has the documentation project received support or assistance from universities? This seems like a very rich foundation for a network of interdisciplinary studies across multiple universities in the US and internationally. And I agree. I think, that is that something you have considered, partnering with a university or some type
I
of?
would, I would like to, and I didn't discuss it in this presentation, but as an addendum to this quilt documentation project, I was, um, I guess because I'm a budget analyst, I don't know, but when I started working on it, I got to thinking about the Great Migration. And the quilts I was finding, this isn't the South. So the quilts didn't originate here. They came here some kind of way. And that's where I got the name Quilts of Consequence. They came here as a result of a condition. And that condition was the Great Migration. And so I got to thinking, let me see, when did these quilts come here? These people are telling me their stories. And so I can track where they originated from and put that to the demographic migration data that the University of Washington has in their database. So I kind of found the university's database online. I did my own charts and my own analysis. And then I got bold, and this was around about the same time you and I started talking. I got kind of bold and I just reached out to the director of history at the university. He was more amazed with all the quilts on the site than he was with the numbers I was feeding him. But we got into a conversation, and he said that they would be glad to help in any way they can. But at that point in time, I just wanted him to validate a sampling I had done on the quilts I had already uncovered, from where they originated, and put that against the migration data that they had on their website. And, I did find that there is a trend that follows the fluctuation of the African-American migration here to Washington. So when I get all this together, I would like that I didn't want it to be a separate piece, but I didn't want it to take away from the quilts, because it was just my own imagination that was, what about this? Just had the question, and I needed the question answered. And so it will be part of this, but it won't be the main part. And yes, I would like to work with the universities more. I just, I just need to keep going. I need to keep going. I still feel like I'm in the infant stages here.
Yeah.
And because there is no ground laid already, I'm just kind of feeling my way through.
Well, it's amazing what you have accomplished. I really encourage everybody. There are a lot of questions about how many quilts you've documented, how you're doing it, virtually. Are you storing the quilts, those kinds of things? And on Adonna's website, there is a section about the documentation project, and she talks a little bit about, how she's going about it. She's got a PDF with some of the quilts she's documented. I think it would be really interesting if you, for any of those of you who had more detailed questions, it does bring around the question of how we're doing this now. During COVID, we're doing everything via Zoom. We're doing everything via email, via not in person. And the Alliance have had to really adjust our programming. Luckily, we were mostly born electronic, born digital with our programming. And I think that that's something that if anyone is interested in learning how to do some documenting via video, but doing interviews via Zoom, we would be glad to be a resource for that. And I'm hoping that, we can all be out in person-to-person situations soon. But it is interesting how we can use these tools to document quilts. We've done some where there's a quilt behind you. This is a quilt by Ali Aller, by the way, if anybody was wondering, where we've interviewed folks just like this, but done an actual documentation where the quilt is behind us. We gather details about the quilt, and the person talks about details about the quilt. It's not the same. It's not, the same by any means. But I think that now moving forward with your projects, both of you, do you think that what you have learned during the pandemic, either about technology or having the time to be separate from the project and the daily, the more interactive tasks of the project, have you had any epiphanies since you've been home and unable to go out?
Mhm.
Well, I think that I will be more willing to communicate with other people in other regions. If someone calls me and says, I have a quilt that you might want to look at, now I think I'm become more comfortable, because I did not grow up with all the computer things, but now I think I would say, okay, can I coach you through this, and let's at least show it, you put it up and let's talk about it in a chat
That's great.
situation. So I think that is very helpful.
Mhm.
And would
And
you, Donna?
oh, and I was going to say, for myself, the use of technology during the pandemic, no, I have not done any documentation during the pandemic. But what I was able to do with my time, so to speak, was I wanted a website just for this project. And I wanted it to be self-containing, so that when I do go back out and start doing it, I can use the website for several things. I have my own quilt guild I run out of the website, and which is kind of neat. It's probably about the only thing that I do right now with the website is run a quilt guild out of it, and then put my quilt history and my project on there. But I will be using it for that. But I had to get it up and running.
Yeah.
And if you're not technology based, I mean, that can take some time. I'm not bad, but I don't know everything. And so it did take some time to get it to do all the things you want it to do. And when I say put that out there, that's what people see. That's what represents you. So you don't want to just put anything out there. And if you can afford it, you should try and make that the best that you can be, because that's what people will see. That's your words out there.
It's so true, and I applaud you both for being willing to present your stories in this format, because I know it's not always easy, but I hope that we've really widened the networks for everyone today, and that everyone, those who didn't get a chance to ask their questions, will follow up. And if you liked our programming today and would like to participate more in our programs, we've got one coming up in September that is a virtual program with an absolutely fantastic roster of speakers. It's called Quilters Take a Moment. You can purchase tickets. Emma will put the link in the chat box, but it's qtm2021.org. And of course, we would love to have all of you as members. It's about how much, let's see, how much fabric could we buy for that? Maybe 2 yards of fabric for the cost of an annual membership. So please go to our website today and become a member. And I thank you, Donna and Lynn, for being with us today. It was a fantastic program, and I hope everyone who joined us today enjoyed it, and I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks. Look
Yeah.
forward to hearing from the other people about the questions they have.
Absolutely.
Definitely, send them on.
We absolutely will. I'm going to be sure that we get a good snapshot of all of those. And we'll save the chat box. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.